We have James Joseph Richardson, who served 21 years. So he was born in 1935, and he was known for wrongly being convicted for the murder of his 7 children by using organic phosphate pesticide marathon in 1967. At the time, he was living in Florida, where all these murders happened. The first day of being poisoned, 6 of his children, ages 4 to 8 years old, passed away, and then the next day, his other 2 children died. So instead of being able to mourn their death, he was locked away as the prime suspect. James was sentenced to die by the court, and he was on death row for 5 years. In 1972, Florida's death penalty changed, taking him off death row, and instead he was just serving a normal sentence. So he was eligible for parole in 1993. But in 1989, new evidence came forth, and this freed James of any wrongdoing. He was released and awarded $1.2 million.
Moving into number 9, we have a Chicago man, Patrick Prince, who was found innocent after spending 26 years in prison. Is this real life right now? I'm 27. I couldn't imagine spending my whole life in prison. He was just 19 years old back in 1991 when he was convicted of murder. Patrick actually confessed to this murder, but when the Innocence Project stepped into this case, it was proven that he was physically and verbally abused until he falsely confessed into murdering someone. It was a corrupt detective and police officer that caused Patrick to serve almost 3 decades behind bars, while an innocent person enjoyed, his morning coffees thinking about murdering again. Because why not? He got away with it this time, so he can just continue getting away with it. Really messed up. A kid who served 42 years in prison. I just can't believe this. This was before he proved his innocence, and he's up next at number 8. This right here is Janelle Pratt, who was convicted back in 1975. During trial, the jury felt like there wasn't enough evidence to convict this guy, but he was sentenced with a back-to-back sentence of a total of 90 years in prison. This is just inhumane. I do believe in reform and a second chance if deemed no longer a threat to society. I'm not saying they can reform in a year. It takes time. 10 years, 15 years. I think the longest sentence should be maybe 25 years with a chance of parole. What do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Well, as soon as technology came around and there was DNA tests, it was easily proven that Janelle was indeed the wrong guy. Moving on, number 7, John Horton. He has just been exonerated from prison after spending 23 years behind bars as an innocent person. When John was 17 years old, he was convicted of murder at a local McDonald's. After a 10-hour interrogation, he actually confessed to the murder because he simply broke down. There's actually a documentary showing thousands of people confessing to murders they actually didn't commit because they couldn't handle the interrogation. They break down and just tell the interrogator what they want to hear so they can stop. Well, this is what happened in this case. It took 23 years to prove this kid was innocent. Well, now he's a man. He didn't kill anyone. It was a very tragic story. Number 6, we have a case that is still ongoing today and has been in the news lately. This right here is 58-year-old Roy Watford, who says he is innocent of the crime that they say he committed 40 years ago. Roy was convicted of a and he had the decision to plead guilty to try to take a lesser sentence. So during the trial, he pleaded guilty to try to get that lesser sentence because it was either that or he's going away for just life. There was no chance of him going as a free person at this time. So during the trial, he pleaded guilty, but he was still given a very harsh sentence. Roy was also diagnosed with an intellectual disability, so he really wasn't able to understand what was happening. So now he wants a retrial and to be tested with DNA because he claims he didn't even get in contact with the person that they claimed he and they have the wrong person. 17 years old at the time, Charles Lamont Lewis has been wrongfully incarcerated for 41 years for a crime he did not commit, and he comes in at number 5. Charles was sentenced to life without parole for killing an off-duty police officer back in 1976. This is a really crazy story, but it took 41 years to uncover the truth. So this took place in Detroit, and the police officer's partner and a number of other eyewitnesses identified the real killer at the scene, but the man was released by a corrupt Detroit police sergeant who later framed Charles Lewis for the murder. He was probably given a ton of money, so it took over 40 years to prove that. It's hard to go against a police sergeant who is supposed to be a very trusted individual who is supposed to fight on the right side of the law. I feel really bad for this guy who lost his whole life because of this sergeant, and I bet he was awarded just like 10 grand. Not saying any amount of money would make this justifiable, but I think he should sue Detroit for everything everything that they have done. And for that police sergeant, he's probably long dead by now, and there's no consequences for him. 16-year-old Giovanni Reed comes up next at number 4. Giovanni has been innocent for over 25 years. He was serving a juvenile life without parole sentence for a 1991 robbery and shooting of a pre-med student. Giovanni was given a plea deal and accepted it. It was a 25-year life sentence, which is so crazy he has to admit to committing a crime just so he doesn't get the death penalty in this situation. So he just took the plea deal, but later he spoke out about his story, about how he was innocent. There was a huge controversy that surrounded this case due to a lot of cover-ups that was discovered later on in this case. There is a documentary about Giovanni because his story is very remarkable, but for all the wrong reasons. Next up, number 3, we have Sharif Cousin, who was an African-American born in New Orleans. He was wrongfully convicted of first-degree murder and he was sentenced to death as a juvenile. He was just 17 years old at the time and he became the youngest condemned convict to be put on death row in Louisiana and one of the youngest in the United States. Sharif was convicted almost solely on one eyewitness. There was no physical evidence that linked this kid to this crime. Sharif was almost killed by the death penalty for this murder, but it was during his case that a small detail was discovered. Okay, so listen to this, get this. The eyewitness couldn't have seen the shooter of this murder because she needs glasses, and during the time of questioning of the scene by the police, she was not wearing glasses. And she's like, she really needs them. Also, another witness confessed that he was coerced into falsely implicated this teenager. The DA quickly dropped this case and the kid was free to go. Terrence Lewis has lived such a crazy life, so let's talk about him at number 2. Terrence was 17 years old when he was convicted of murder and he was sent to life in prison for second-degree murder. This took place in Philadelphia and this case has gone to many courts, and one judge actually said he believes Terrence to be innocent from all of the evidence that was presented in front of him, but it's up to the jury to decide the fate of Terrence. Terrence has been in jail since 1996 keeping his innocence. While lawyers and prosecutors looked into this case, they found very little evidence against this kid, and there was a very credible witness that said Terrence wasn't even at the location of the murder, but for some reason this kid is still left in prison. There has been a legal team that took on this case as a pro bono, meaning no one was paid for the legal fees. They just wanted to do it for free because they believed in this guy. They did this because after looking into the case, they couldn't believe that this kid is still in prison. And finally, at number 1, we have Sharon Thomas, who has just been released after spending 24 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He was accused of murder back in 1990 when he was a teenager. The legal process for many of these cases can take years to complete. For this guy, it took 24 years to prove he didn't kill anyone. I think it's just ridiculous. So for 24 years, an innocent person was in prison for life while the murderer was living his life. Something is for sure wrong with the justice system after going over this whole list with you guys. Starting off this very unfair list at number 10 with Santiago Ventura Morales. In 1986, he was convicted of murdering a 19-year-old man after they had an argument. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but maintained his innocence despite being offered a plea deal. He made several appeals after his conviction, but they were all denied. However, due to a lack of an appropriate interpreter and other deficiencies in the trial, it actually led to his conviction being overturned, and it was determined that a different person was responsible for the murder. He spent about 5 years in prison as an innocent man, but he had plans to become a lawyer someday so that he can help people in a very similar situation. And like I said, we all know there's many people in this situation.
Now at number 9, we have Daryl Burton, who served 24 years. He was put in jail for murder back in 1985. There was a shooting at a gas station. He was the prime suspect, so his sentence was 50 years. There was claims saying that police fabricated the investigation. The night of the killing, there was an eyewitness that told police that they saw a light-skinned black man no taller than 5 foot 5 inches tall, and he was the shooter. Well, Daryl, he's a 5 foot 10 inch dark black guy, so how is he the suspect? So the claim against Daryl had no physical evidence linking him to this murder, and there was no weapon ever recovered. In court, his lawyers was able to get him death by incarceration instead of death by lethal injection. Well, in 2008, evidence suggested that he was the wrong man, and we need to clear this guy right away. So he was released, and his release date was actually the exact same day Barack Obama signed in to become the US president. Moving on to number 8. We have Stephen Phillips, and he served 25 years in prison. And he was sentenced away for back in 1982, him and his wife started a roofing business, and they were expecting their first child. Stephen was described as a really brilliant man, but their family ended that year. Stephen was the prime suspect for rape. And it wasn't just one person, it was a string of crimes. He had 2 trials back in 1982 and 1983. In court, he was forced to plead guilty on the charges. And that was to prevent a 3rd trial, which was potentially going to get him locked away for life. So he tried to take a lesser sentence. So the next decade passed, and his wife and his child has been visiting him in jail. But in 1992, it just became too much, and they got a divorce. It wasn't working out. Well, 24 years later, when DNA became available, the DNA during that crime tested positive to another man. And this was the guy that actually did the raping. It wasn't Steven, although he pleaded guilty to this crime that he did not do many years ago. So in 2009, he was released from jail as an innocent man. He was awarded $6 million. But now his ex-wife from 17 years ago who got divorced thinks that she's entitled to some of this money. So now she's suing him for $4 million, and I think this is just the saddest thing ever. This man deserves that money. Charles Chapman, who served 27 years, comes in at number 7. He was convicted in 1981 and was sentenced to jail for 99 years. His charge was aggravated rape. Charles was accused of going inside a 52-year-old woman's house, taking off her clothes, tying her down with a scarf, and then raping her. And then he stole $15 in cash. The 52-year-old described the suspect as an African American. Charles Chapman was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was released in 2008 when DNA proved that it wasn't him. They have had the wrong man behind bars for the past 27 years. This man's life was totally robbed from him. And you know what? It was mainly because he was black. Charles became the 15th inmate from Dallas County since 2001 to be exonerated by DNA testing. Now we have William Dillon, who also served 27 years in prison. He comes in at number 6. William was a young man who was about to sign a professional baseball deal to play in the major leagues back in 1981. But he was framed for a gruesome murder of a gay man on the Florida beach. He was only 21 years old at the time, and he had everything to live for. He was going to be a pitcher making millions of dollars. It seemed to be a common pattern, but DNA testings proved him innocent. They then identified William as the wrong guy. So in 2008, he was released on a $100,000 bond. But a few years later, in 2012, he was granted a full pardon by the state of Florida. Since his release, he has gone on to sing a very emotional national anthem at a baseball game. Okay, moving in to number Michael Green. He's another man who served 27 years. And again, the trend continues. He was in jail for rape back in 1983. He was 18 years old at the time. He was given 75 years in prison. Well, finally, after 27 years, he has been released. And he was awarded $2.2 million in compensation payments from the state of Texas. But to receive this, he would have to waive the right to sue the state for falsely imprisoning him. Michael, since his release, has had trouble sleeping. He has spent almost 3 decades in prison thinking, why was he in there for so long? He also said this money is absolutely nothing when you can compare it to the time that he spent with mental torture and physical abuse. Number 4, Glenn Ford, and he served 30 years. He was in jail for the murder of an older white man, and he owned a jewelry and watch repair shop. So the crime was pinned on Glenn. At this time, he just had a son. Now at the age of 64 years old, he was proven innocent. When he got out of jail, there was a lot of reporters asking him, do you feel any resentment? He said, yes, because I've been locked up for many years for something that I didn't do. I can't go back to the time I was in my 30s and do the things that I would have done back then. He is now a grandpa and he's lost his whole life. Really sad story, but someone who spent even more time, Cornelius Dupree Jr. at 30 years. Same amount of years as the other guy, but this guy spent a little bit more months. So he comes in at number 3. In 1979, he was just 20 years old when he was in jail for a robbery case that turned into a case. So he was sentenced to wait 75 years in prison. And the whole time he was there, he maintained his innocence, even refusing parole, because then he would have to be registered as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Well, in 2011, he was exonerated for any wrongdoing. So he was entitled to $80,000 for every year that he spent in jail, which was many. So when you add that all up, that's about $2.4 million, plus a lifetime of annuity, which was more fixed payments to him for the rest of his life. And you know what? It's kind of stupid how he's awarded so much money by the state, but once he receives this money, he has to claim it as an income, and the state is just going to take money away from him for taxes. In at number 2, we have James Bain, and he served 35 years. He is one of the most positive people in life, even after everything that he went through. He was wrongly convicted of breaking and entering and kidnapping and and this is in 1974. James was sentenced to life in prison. The next 35 years, he was transferred around between 6 different prisons across the state of Florida. When he was released, there was camera crews everywhere and also thousands of people who believed in his story. He now wears his favorite t-shirt that says, "Not guilty." When he got out, he received $1.7 in compensation. Finally, at number 1, it's time to reveal the longest prison sentence ever served by an innocent person. So in at number 1, we have Lewis Taylor, and he served 42 years. In 1970, there was an arson attack on a hotel that killed 29 people. At just 16 years old at that time, Lewis was blamed for this crime. He was a black teenager who entered a courtroom with all white jury members. And this is at a time period where racism was like really up there. Lewis was sentenced to 28 consecutive life sentences. The whole time he maintained his innocence and was claimed he was wrongly convicted. And he said police failed to investigate other suspects that night. Now at the age of 59 years old, new evidence came forth and he walked out of prison as a free man. So on the night back in 1970, it was not only proven that he didn't light that hotel on fire, but that night he was actually saving people from the hotel. He was getting people out of the fire. So for 42 years, the state has locked up a hero. Really sad justice system.
In at number 10, we have Demarlo Barry, who has been in prison for the past 22 years. Well, now for the first time, he has proven his innocence, but it was a long and hard fight. Demarlo was convicted of murdering someone in the Carl's Jr. parking lot. The trial was lengthy, and after 22 years, it was proven that a government witness lied to the jury that led them to convict him to life in prison. I couldn't imagine this guy's mindset, being in prison for over 2 decades for doing nothing wrong. I would go insane. Timothy Masters comes into this list at number 9. On February 11th, 1987, the body of Peggy Hetrick was found in a field, and she had been stabbed in the back and mutilated. 15-year-old Timothy Masters lived in a trailer that was only 100 feet away from her body. The police questioned him and searched his room and found several thousand pages of violent journal entries and drawings in his closet and a collection of knives. Even though there's no physical evidence linked him to the crime, he was charged and convicted of the murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Well, 12 years later, his sentence was later removed when DNA evidence proved his innocence. Timothy Masters was given $5.9 million in order to settle the wrongful conviction lawsuit. The wrongfully convicted Marvin Anderson comes into this list at number 8. Marvin Anderson was only 18 years old when he was convicted of robbery, sodomy, abduction, rape. An all-white jury convicted him on all the counts, and he was sentenced away to 210 years in prison. I mean, is this real life right now? However, in 1988, another man came forward and admitted that he was the one that actually committed the crime. He fully confessed under oath. He did this in an open court, but the judge who presided over the original trial refused to drop the charge on Marvin Anderson. Marvin spent a total of 15 years in prison, but it took another 4 years to become fully exonerated. And now at number 7, we have Dennis Brown. He was convicted of back in 1984 when he was only 17 years old, and this is after the victim picked him out of a lineup. When they stand there and you're like, oh, he's the man, number 3. Dennis Brown claimed that the police had threatened him at knife point, forcing him to confess to the charges. The jury found him guilty, and when he was charged with aggravated rape, burglary, and aggravated crimes against nature, which gave him a sentence of life imprisonment. Dennis Brown contacted the Innocence Project, and DNA tests concluded that he was not the rapist. So in 2004, after serving 19 years in prison for a crime he never committed, he was finally released. The Dixmoor 5 comes into this list at number 6. The Dixmoor 5 are 5 African American men who were falsely convicted of and murder of a 14-year-old Kateresa Matthews. At the time of the arrest, the 5 men were between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. During the intense and long interviews, 3 of them gave false confessions because they were coerced and physically abused and threatened during the interrogation. Each of them received at least 80 years in prison, but in 2011, DNA tests concluded that the semen on the victim belonged to another man. All of the charges were dropped after they spent 20 years in prison, and they finally became free men in 2011. They reached a wrongful conviction settlement of $40 million, which is actually the largest settlement in Illinois' history. Moving on to Thomas Haynesworth, and he makes it onto this list at number 5. He was arrested at the age of 18 years old after a woman identified him as the attacker. He was convicted of 4 violent rape sentenced to a total of 84 years in prison. Thomas Haynesworth maintained his innocence throughout his time spent in prison, and based on new DNA evidence, the real perpetrator was believed to have been his neighbor and closely resembles him. After the DNA testing, he was exonerated and was released from prison in March of 2011 after spending 27 years in prison behind bars. So for this wrongful conviction, he was given a lump sum of $1 million. I bet you the guy was taxed on it. It only took home like just over half. He had 2 types of pensions, and he was also given a tuition at a community college. Christopher Abernathy takes the number 4 spot. On October 5th, 1984, the body of a 15-year-old girl was found behind a shopping mall. She had been raped and stabbed to death. More than a year after the crime, police brought in 18-year-old Christopher Abernathy for questioning. After 40 hours of interrogation, he had signed a confession which stated that he attempted to her and accidentally stabbed her with a pocket knife. Christopher was a high school dropout, and he had a learning disability as well. So the police used this and coerced him into making a false confession. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison because he was 17 years old at the time of the murder. The jury initially wanted him to get the death penalty. After the Innocence Project picked up his case, new DNA evidence exonerated him of all charges, and he was released after spending 28 years behind bars as an innocent person. The West Memphis 3 ironically make it into number 3 spot. This was a murder case that shocked the world. 3 little boys were found tied up. They were tied up with their own shoelaces, beaten, and left for dead. The local authorities arrested 18-year-old Damian Eccles, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and 17-year-old Jesse Miss Kelly because they were known around town for wearing black and listening to heavy metal. All 3 of these teenagers were convicted of the murders and were sentenced away to serve life in prison, except for Damian Eccles, who was sentenced to death. This is a highly controversial case because all of the evidence was circumstantial, so a lot of people believe that they are actually innocent. The Scottsboro Boys comes into this list at number 2. They are 9 African American teenagers who are accused of raping 2 white women on a train back in 1931. These were 9 unemployed young men who were illegally riding the train. They were held in Alabama on minor charges, and they convinced these 2 women into saying that these young boys had raped them. Within 2 weeks of this false accusation, the Scottsboro Boys were convicted, and 8 of them were sentenced to death. And the youngest boy, who was 13 years old, was sentenced to life imprisonment. One of the women who have claimed to be a victim came forth and admitted that she was coerced and manipulated into accusing these boys of raping her when they never even touched her. And finally, in a number 1 spot, we have George Stinney. On March 1944, 2 young girls had been found brutally murdered and beaten over the head and dumped into a ditch. George Stinney was a 14-year-old African American who was convinced of the murder as a result of racially biased and discriminatory jury. He was convinced in less than 10 minutes by an all-white jury, and he was sentenced to death. He was denied an appeal, and he was executed by the electric chair. A group of lawyers and activists investigated this case, and in 2014 he was exonerated of all the charges nearly 70 years later.